So thank you everybody again for joining us for this webinar launch of SEARAC's resource guide for Southeast Asian Americans facing criminal deportation. This guide was just released, I guess essentially September of this year, and it was a joint project between SEARAC and the American University Immigrant Justice Clinic with support from a number of our partners all throughout the country. This guide was produced by advocates who believe in fighting for families to stay together and the importance of producing information to support legal community and impacted families to help fight the difficult process of deportation. Before we get started, I just wanted to give you guys an idea of who our panelists will be. They will be speaking later on in the presentation, but we're really excited to have, first of all, Bill Hing, who is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco, and he was one of the key partners in helping us develop this resource guide. He's going to be the legal advocate or the legal expert that we have on the panel. So if you guys have any specific legal questions, he would be the person to address those later on. Next, we have Lundy Coy. So Lundy is currently the operations manager over here at SEARAC, and she also has a personal deportation case that SEARAC actually helped with advocacy on a few years ago, so she's going to be sharing a little bit about that. And lastly, we have Mia Leah Kiernan of One Love, and she is a community advocate that's going to be sharing a little bit about their strategy with regards to repatriation agreements and the work they've been doing to fight back against deportations within the Southeast Asian American community. So to provide folks just a bit of background on the development of this guide and basically why it came about. I guess as you can probably assume from the title, this guide was created primarily to be a resource for Southeast Asians from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam facing criminal deportations. So this community is very unique. It's the largest refugee community ever resettled in the United States as a result of one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Because of this, Southeast Asian Americans encountered many challenges during their initial resettlement into the country, including high rates of poverty, post-traumatic stress disorder, and poor educational outcomes. Oftentimes, youth growing up in impoverished neighborhoods and failing schools turn to gangs and crime as a means of survival. Today, over 2.5 million Southeast Asian Americans live in the country, but at least 15,000 community members have received final orders of deportation, more than 12,000 of which are based on old criminal convictions. Many of these community members came to the country as refugees, raised as Americans, and a significant number of deportees were born in refugee camps and never stepped foot in their native country. U.S. immigration policies passed in 1996 in the form of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and the Legal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act are responsible for many of the mass deportation outcomes among Southeast Asian Americans that we continue to see today. These laws drastically shifted the immigration policy to focus on stricter enforcement measures. Specifically, they were responsible for 3 devastating changes to immigration laws. One is, these laws expanded the definition of aggravated felonies for which immigrants could be deported. 2, they eliminated the ability of immigration judges to use discretion when evaluating a person's deportation case. And finally, these laws were retroactive in nature, meaning that even those that had committed crimes prior to the passage of the law could still be deported. So this blanket enforcement approach resulted in double jeopardy for many immigrant communities, particularly for individuals who had already served their time and reformed their lives. Because of these circumstances, a unique need arose for the creation of a guide that could specifically help Southeast Asian Americans navigate the complex immigration system in this country. It is important to remember, however, that this guide in particular is not meant to replace the skills and knowledge that can be obtained by working directly with an experienced immigration attorney. We recommend that this guide be used in consultation with advocates and lawyers who are familiar with the immigration law and policy. So if you've had the chance to review the deportation guide, you can see that it goes into depth into many of the technical questions that those facing deportation are confronted with when navigating the immigration system. The purpose of this webinar specifically is to provide a brief overview of the contents and subject matter discussed in the guide. And our panel will also be talking about their experiences with criminal deportation, and they'll share their insights on how this guide can be useful for the Southeast Asian American community. Unfortunately, since we have very limited time, we won't be able to go into depth on all of the questions addressed in the material. However, if you have specific questions after reading the guide, we do welcome you to please share them at the end of the presentation so that our panelists and our experts can help to address any concerns that you may have. So among the various topics discussed in the guideline are those projected on the webinar screen. So from questions regarding how to know the deportation consequences of one's criminal conviction, to how to request to be released from detention, to information regarding mandatory detention and options for fighting deportation. We also provide some information on repatriation agreements between the U.S. and Cambodia and Vietnam, and the absence of an agreement with the U.S. and Laos. And Nia Leah will be providing a little bit more background on that work later on in the webinar as well. For those, again, that have gotten the chance to review the guide, there are 5 main sections, which goes through a number of commonly asked questions in each of the following stages of detention and deportation. So for the first section of the guide is under the main heading, pre-deportation. This section basically refers to the period prior to deportation proceedings or arrest by immigration officers, and it reviews important information for legal permanent residents with criminal charges and basically what they should know about their rights. The next section goes into questions regarding detention. So this section covers a variety of topics ranging from how to access your immigration file, to how to get out of detention, and what constitutes mandatory detention. The third section of the guide, if you're following along, is deportation proceedings. So this section provides, it's actually one of the, I find, one of the most helpful resources in the guide. It provides a list of options for individuals fighting a deportation order based on a criminal conviction. It gives options of relief that they could access. And these forms of relief, again, are best discussed with an experienced immigration lawyer in order to assess the likelihood of being granted these forms of relief. The next section is the post-deportation order. This section basically summarizes what individuals can expect after a deportation order has been issued. It addresses questions about being released from detention and basically how to go on with one's life. As many of you will learn through reading the guide, many Southeast Asian Americans often live in the country for years after receiving a deportation order without actually being deported. And then lastly, which I find also one of the most key resources on the guide, is the resource section. So this section is one of the most important parts. It provides a comprehensive list of organizations and individuals through the country that are working on helping to fight deportations based on old criminal convictions. We encourage everyone to look at this section and to share it broadly with their networks. We recognize that this portion of the guide is still a work in progress. We are open to any suggestions folks might have in terms of partners you've been working on that you think would be a good addition to the guide. So we hope to continue to further grow this base. And if you have recommendations, I'm going to provide my email at the end of the webinar if you would like to shoot me those suggestions. The last section of the guide just goes into a list of references as well as a glossary of terms which you might find helpful when explaining a number of the more complicated terms mentioned throughout the book. As I mentioned earlier, Southeast Asian Americans come from a very unique refugee experience, one that is full of obstacles and multiple layers of trauma. SEARAC has worked with a number of individuals trying to fight their deportation cases. A number of them have served their time, reformed their lives, and have become contributing members to their community. Many are parents, siblings, and spouses. And it's important to remember that deportation touches not only the lives of the impacted person, but their family and community as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters to share their experiences on deportations based on old criminal convictions from the perspective of an impacted individual, a community advocate, and a legal advocate. As our presenters are speaking, feel free to type your questions in the chat box or the question box as they present. And remember that we will only be addressing these questions at the very end of the webinar. So first, I'd like to introduce everyone to Lundy Coy. I mentioned earlier that Lundy currently works at SEARAC. SEARAC worked with Lundy a few years ago to help her with advocacy efforts around her personal deportation case. So I'd like to turn it over to her now so she can share with you her story, as well as the different challenges and barriers that she had to overcome in trying to navigate the legal system. She'll also share her thoughts on how this guide could be a helpful resource for other impacted individuals like herself. So Lundy, take it away.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you for everyone for being available for this call. My name is Lundy Coy, and like Katrina has shared with everyone, I am currently facing deportation because of an old criminal conviction from 2001. My story began, I arrived to the U.S. in 1981 with my mom and dad, but before moving to the U.S., my family escaped a genocide and war in Cambodia that torn their country apart. They arrived in Thailand, and soon after finding refuge, my mom gave birth to her first child, which was me, in a refugee camp. Then a year later, they were given papers to move to the U.S., and we settled in Long Beach, California, where I grew up with my other two siblings who are also U.S. citizens. I grew up in a very strict Cambodian home and had a very sheltered life. But when it was time for college, I was very inexperienced when it came to social settings. I spent most of my high school years studying and reading. I wasn't allowed to have a social life. I didn't mind it. I was used to that life. I enjoyed reading my books, and time with my family was very precious to me. But in my first year of college as a freshman, I made some very poor choices because I just didn't know any better. I was very young and naive, inexperienced, and eager to make friends. And well, after one night out with my friends in my freshman year, I was holding 7 tablets of ecstasy that were ours. And my friend at the time was loudly talking about the ecstasy pills. And there were cops nearby whom heard the mention of the drug and then approached the both of us. I was honest about the drugs being in my purse, and I was arrested. And that year I was sentenced and given 4 years of probation. I returned to school and started working again full-time, and went back to school and was near to completing my probation successfully until ICE, which is Immigration, Custom, and Enforcement, showed up at one of my probation meetings and detained me in 2004. There, they kept me in detention, and while I was there, I went through the proceedings for my deportation case. I lost my case because my crime was considered an aggravated felony, and by law in Congress, that was an automatic deportation. Even the judge couldn't help me. So as of today, I have a final order of removal, and constantly am living under the fear of deportation, like the 15,000 other Southeast Asians who are facing this deportation with me. So when I was detained by ICE, I was at loss. My family were confused. We didn't know if something like this could ever happen. There was no manual or any type of guide like the one that Katrina is introducing today, to help us navigate the system. Most of the answers that I would get were mainly from other people that were detained with me that were going through the proceeding. I finally learned what an aggravated felony meant, and I learned it from another person that was detained. There was no resources in the detention that was provided to help us navigate the system. So my other resources was my lawyer. Fortunately, my parents were able to help me and to obtain a lawyer to help us through this process. But there are many others that were fortunate enough to have that benefit, right? So during my advocacy work, I learned we are facing many challenges ahead of us. I'm learning that the process is very slow, but we have to keep moving forward, trying to find a win. I see too many families being torn apart because of the current law. And the aggravated felony section of the law makes it hard for us to fight our case. And the law also stripped away from immigration judges to make the decisions themselves. So when I was going through the proceeding, I couldn't imagine that the judge wouldn't listen to my case and find it in his heart to say, poor her, she's been here since she was 1 year old. She has a green card. She came here as a refugee. She's back in school. She's working, seeing the human side of my story instead of just looking at the one mistake that I made in my freshman year of school. But I learned that when you have an aggravated felony as myself, and mine was because of possession of ecstasy, it's an automatic removal from the U.S. Even the judge himself couldn't do anything to help me. And currently, the memorandum of understanding that we have between the U.S. and certain Southeast Asian countries are not also helping us in this process. They're breaking our communities apart. It would have been very helpful to have some type of guide that Katrina is introducing today to just at least learn the language and help educate ourselves to help navigate the system. It wouldn't provide all the answers, but at least would enlighten me a little bit to kind of know, what steps I need to take in order to try to figure out my case, or if I did have to go through deportation, which one day I might have to do that, how would I go about doing that? What are my first steps? And it's helpful to have a guide such as this to kind of help us navigate the system. And I hope the guide will help others and their family learn about the process and to use the resources that are available in the guide to help educate themselves. And with that, I'd like to pass it back to Katrina.
Great. Thank you so much, Lundy, for sharing your story. And if folks didn't know, Lundy is actually on the cover of the guide, so that's her picture that's prominently displayed in front. So next, I wanted to introduce our community advocate, Mia Leah Kiernan, who, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, is with One Love in Philadelphia. Mia Leah has worked extensively with the Southeast Asian American community to help fight deportation cases. In the recent months, One Love has launched a campaign to stop deportations by focusing on the role of repatriation agreements, or the MOUs that Lundy was talking about earlier, in strengthening harmful enforcement policies that lead to mass deportation. So I'll hand it over to Mia Leah to give us a little background on these repatriation agreements, and then share her experience as a community advocate fighting the deportation of Southeast Asian Americans. She will also share how this guide could be beneficial for a broader community of advocates. So Amelia.
Hi everyone, thank you, Katrina. My name is Amelia, and I am with One Love, and I'm here on this call also representing the Southeast Asian Freedom Network, which is a collective of Southeast Asian grassroots groups that work towards community organizing initiatives around the country. So I think I'll just talk about, go kind of how we came to this repatriation agreement campaign, which is that for a very long time, SEARAC and One Love and other grassroots groups have been working to address the 1996 laws that Katrina broke down earlier. And it's been very difficult, especially inside of Congress and where it is right now, and seeing that last fall, the executive order that came down from the president when it was clear that comprehensive immigration reform was not going to go through, that executive order actually made it worse for a lot of people with past criminal convictions facing deportation. And so there was a need to think about a new strategy in a different direction. And a lot of groups have also done really amazing work on the ground locally, thinking about advocacy to district attorneys' offices to understand the consequences of criminal convictions on immigrants and refugees, as well as ICE detainer work in Philadelphia here as well, and trying to just separate ICE and law enforcement in local cities. But even with all of that, we still haven't been able to stop the separation of families in our community. And so last fall, we kind of reflected on what we have learned through this whole experience over the last over a decade now, and just thinking about what are the lessons that we've learned, which is that a few things. One, that politics often isolates individuals and families in this fight, and that we need to stand together as a whole community with those most impacted in order to make the most impact for the whole community. Another thing is that there's also divisions inside of the movement around level of crime, so low-level criminal offenders and high-level criminal offenders, and what we see is that we need to act violence as a whole in order to really make large impact as well, and not throw anybody under the bus. Another piece is that we have to talk about this fight as demanding our human rights, and not talking about it as if we need to beg for our right to be deserving of being with our families. Another piece is that this fight has to be about our whole lives and histories inside and outside of the U.S., so remembering and messaging why we are here in the first place as Southeast Asian Americans. And the other part is that because most of our folks, it is very hard legally to stop the deportations from happening, that many of our folks end up being deported. And so this fight has to be a global one that includes our deported community as part of the movement, and that it's a fight not just to end deportation, but to also bring people back and give people the right to return. And lastly, that this year, 2015, is the 40th year since Southeast Asian Americans have come to this country as refugees, and that is in this year that we need to stand up against further displacement of our community. And so with all of those that thinking and processing, we found that going back and taking another look at these repatriation agreements and where they are rooted and how they formed was important. And so what we kind of laid out for ourselves was that in 1996 these laws passed, and then many people were handed down deportation orders but couldn't be removed, right, because there was no agreement between the U.S. and Cambodia, or the U.S. Vietnam, or U.S. and Laos at that time. What we saw then was like folks being held in detention for long periods of time. And then there was a Supreme Court case of Kim Ho-ma, a Cambodian man, in 2001, where he challenged indefinite detention and won, and made it so that ICE couldn't hold people past 6 months if they couldn't be deported. But it was following that win that the U.S. very quickly signed a repatriation agreement with Cambodia in order to be able to deport people, and that was in 2002. And so we saw quickly people being removed to Cambodia. And then it was in 2007 that the U.S. approached Vietnam to sign the same kind of agreement. But the Vietnamese community and leadership saw what was happening to the Cambodian community, that it was former refugees and people impacted by U.S. wars that was being deported back. And so they made their agreement in a very specific way to protect people who had come to the U.S. as refugees, so that that wouldn't happen in the community. And then we see that Laos, right, doesn't have an agreement at all still, but that they are still deporting people to Laos even without an agreement. And so what we're looking at in terms of asks and demands is that we really want the Vietnamese agreement to stay the same, right, that it continues to protect communities, and there are negotiations of them trying to expand this agreement, and so this is a really important ask. Two is that we want the Cambodian agreement to model the Vietnamese agreement, right, so that people who are impacted by the same U.S. wars in Southeast Asia are protected. And that Laos, if there ever is an agreement that's signed, that it model the same as well. So it's a Southeast Asian community fight that we have to do together. And I think on the broader scale, what we're thinking about is that all diaspora communities should have input into the repatriation agreements that impact them, and that these kind of contracts should not be signed secretly without any community input, and that they shouldn't be signed as part of trade deals or visa deals or aid deals, right? That they are human, they are about human beings and should be seen that way. And so we did just launch the campaign, as Katrina said, over the weekend. In over 14 cities around the U.S. were able to organize launch events, including in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And I think that with this release of this guide, we'll also support the building of this movement and the momentum, because as Lundy was saying earlier, I think that what happens, disempowerment happens when decision-making power is taken away from individuals and communities, and when there isn't information given to people so that they can make the best decisions for their own families, that is when disempowerment happens. And so by releasing a guide like this, that SEARAC is offering that back to communities in order to make the right decisions for themselves in these really complicated situations. So I'll get back to you, Katrina.
Great, thank you, Mialia. So I hope everybody was able to get a better context about these deportations in terms of these repatriation agreements or these MOUs that we have with Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. It really sets the stage of these mass deportations that we have been seeing in recent years. So next, I wanted to turn it over to our last speaker for the panel. We have Bill Hang. As I mentioned earlier on the call, he's a professor over at the University of San Francisco. He's also a SEARAC board member and founder and board member of the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. Bill has years of experience as an immigration lawyer and was one of the key partners who helped to review this guide. Bill will be sharing with us how attorneys can use this guide to be an effective legal advocate and share with us some advice to advocates and individuals when trying to fight deportations based on old criminal convictions. So Bill, if you can take it over.
Thank you, Katrina, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm happy to be on this panel with Katrina, who's helped to organize this very competently and helped to see the follow-through of the publication of the manual. And I'm very happy to be on the panel with Lundy and Mialia, with whom I've worked for many years, and I respect her work very much. So let me first mention that in terms of a resource for attorneys, the guide is an excellent overview of the deportation challenges that Southeast Asians face, and it's very complete, very concise, it's accurate, and I urge immigration advocates to read it cover to cover and to soak it all in, because I think that it's very valuable, and I wish something like this had been done sooner. Now, on the basic issue of deportation of Southeast Asians, beginning with Cambodians, that phenomenon came as a big surprise. It came as a surprise to Lundy. It came as a surprise to the dozens of other Cambodians with whom I've met, and the few Vietnamese with whom I've met who have been subject to deportation, in large part because the United States did not have a history prior to the early 2000s. The U.S. did not have a prior history of deporting refugees back to countries, especially refugees who were fleeing from countries that were communist-dominated the country. So that was very surprising to not just the deportees, but also to attorneys in the field, and very disappointing that the United States would engage in that effort. But the timing of the deportation is never good, but it was particularly bad because the deportations began a few years after 1996, when the immigration laws changed and precluded relief for those individuals such as Lundy who are classified as aggravated felons. prior to 1996, there was a relief that was available, and this is explained in the guide. But after 1996, a specific type of waiver no longer is available. There are, however, some other technical categories where someone might be able to fit into, and that's why reference to the guide is very important. In spite of that, there are some limited legal remedies, but there are also political remedies on individual cases that that should be considered. But in every instance, one of the first things that somebody who is either facing deportation or who might face deportation because the person's at an early stage, for example, is only now facing criminal charges, it's of utmost importance for those individuals to find a competent and knowledgeable attorney to advise them. Because if it's at the criminal stage, that's better than getting an attorney after the conviction, and it's certainly better than getting an attorney after the deportation order has been entered. So the three stages are important, but the earlier you can get an attorney or good legal advice, the better. The guide is also important to send the message that those individuals who are facing deportation are not alone. There are resources available. There are clinics. There are other attorneys that are available to advise and try to help those folks. So individually, you're not standing alone, and it's important for you to realize. On the other hand, we need your help also. And while we're primarily talking about individual cases, of course, Leah is talking about a bigger policy change on the repatriation agreements. We're not only battling on behalf of individuals, but we're battling on behalf of policy change. And policy change can come both administratively and congressionally. And that's something that we're constantly attempting to do. It's not the easiest battle in this era of not just anti-immigrant and anti-criminal sentiment in the country. That's why we need everyone's help to jump on board to help resolve this problem so that we can get rid of it once and for all. Thank you, Katrina.
Thank you so much, Bill. So I want to thank each of our panelists for sharing with us their expertise. That concludes the formal presentation of the resource guide. I would like to invite participants now to type in any questions they may have for the panelists. If you're logged into the webinar, you should be able to see a control screen. Under the chat or questions function, you could just type in your question there, and if you want to direct it to a specific panelist, feel free to specify that as well. So no questions, folks? We have, oh wait, well, someone's raising their hand. It's rare that you have all of these experts on the phone all at once. So any questions you may have, don't be shy about it. Okay, we have a question. Okay, this comes from Ben de Guzman, one of our partners. He's asking, what kind of appetite has the Obama administration shown in bringing refugee communities into conversations about repatriation agreements? So Leah, you might be the best person to tackle that. Leah?
Yes. What kind of appetite has the Obama administration shown for bringing refugees into conversation about repatriation agreements?
Correct.
Yeah. I think that we are still working with SEARAC and also the White House Initiative on Asian American and Pacific Islanders, as well as many other groups to try to push that conversation forward. So I think that this is a new realm of advocacy for all of us, right? And so I think that we are still strategizing on how to best make that impact and move towards repatriation agreement strategy. But we all are feeling really positive about it so far, and that there is real possibility to try and move something before the end of the Obama administration. And you know, we also know that it kind of has to happen before Obama leaves office, because we may be ruled by Donald Trump in 2016. So that would be the answer to the question, I think.
Thank you, Mialia. So for our next question, this comes from Christopher Larson. And I think this question might be something Bill might be able to answer. The question is, well, it's not really a question, it's a statement. So for me to be released from custody, I had to show proof of employment. Yet when I was released, they didn't want to give me a work permit. So Bill, I don't know if you wanted to speak to that.
Well, that's unfortunately a symptom of the craziness of the Department of Homeland Security. I've known other people who have faced that situation as well. So what you have to do is your attorney has to apply with you for employment authorization, which both ICE and CIS have the authority to do that. They're both part of the Department of Homeland Security. And explain to them that you're put in this difficult position, and that and get a letter from a prospective employer, if possible, that in fact you will be offered a job if you are given a work permit. And sometimes that does the trick. So you have a family member get a letter from somebody who can say, yes, I will hire this person, and this person will be paid X amount of money and hired X number of hours per week. But that's the only suggestion that I can think of that seems to have worked.
Great, thank you, Bill. And if folks have follow-up questions to Bill and any of the other panelists, I did include their email addresses early on, so I'm sure they would be happy to speak to you guys once the webinar is over. So for the next question, it's a comment combined with a question. It's great to hear Lundy's story. I was wondering what the gender breakdown of those with deportation orders are. So in terms of the data SEARAC has been working on, unfortunately, I don't know off the top of my head what the breakdown is for gender. I'm sure the information is out there. But to this point, we haven't looked exclusively at it. But I will actually make a point on my list here to find out that data and get back to the person that sent this to me. So feel free to follow up with me also. My email is on the webinar presentation slide.
Can I add to that, Katrina?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Mila. You might be able to know.
Yeah, no, I don't know all the numbers, but I know in Cambodia of the deportee community, there of 450 something people who've been deported, and about 11 women.
Great. That actually gives us a pretty good idea of proportion-wise. So for our next question, well, this is more of a comment. Hello, my name is Edna Monroy with the California Immigrant Youth Justice Center. This person just wants to know how to connect with us, how to learn more about pending cases, and how to share strategies to continue pushing back on ongoing criminalization and the priority enforcement program implementation, especially in California. So I know like One Love has actively worked on pushing back on these harmful policies that criminalize immigrant communities. So I do encourage folks to reach out to Mialia. Her email I had shared earlier on the presentation, and I can share that after the webinar as well. In terms of contacting folks over here at SEARAC, you can contact me at katrina@searac.org. We have been working on a few individual advocacy for those undergoing deportation here in the past year. And I would love to sort of strategize on how to move forward in fighting a lot of these unjust deportation cases. Another question that we have is, how can community members being directly impacted by deportation contribute to the language of the agreement? So I'm assuming the repatriation agreement is the question it's talking about. Mia Leah, would you have any insight to that?
Hey, yes. Yep, I think that we definitely want as much input as possible, and so it's a strategy that is definitely not just housed inside of One Love. It's housed inside of the Southeast Asian Freedom Network, which is all across the country. And so we want to have some national calls coming up in the next couple months to make sure that there is clear feedback and clear demands coming from a larger collective. So you can sign up for our listserv and at onelovemovement.wordpress.com and be in touch with us.
So Amelia, there's also a follow-up question to that. Can you expand, well, this person's asking, can you expand on your statement that a number of Laotians have been deported back to Laos despite no repatriation agreement? I'm curious to know about this.
Yeah. So I think that there is not a lot, because there's no repatriation agreement, there's not a lot of record of folks who've been deported to Laos, because what repatriation agreements also do is lay out a process for people to go back to their home countries. And so some of that process, for instance, in Cambodia, is to go through getting identification of what it looks like and birth certificates, et cetera, et cetera. And so because that doesn't exist for Laos, a lot of it happens under the radar. And so how we know about folks being deported to Laos actually is through families, right? It's not through any documented, any kind of documented information from the government. And so it's just us knowing families, Lao families who know people who have been deported or people in their families who've been deported. And we know that there is no agreement in place for that to be happening. And so what some of those are for instance, green cards being expired, but many for criminal convictions. And unfortunately, we just don't know a number because of the lack of documentation.
Great. Thank you, Melia. So for our next question, Bill might be the best person to answer this. With people who currently have a removal order but cannot be deported, what is their current legal status and what types of benefits are they eligible for? Example, do they have a work permit? Can they get health care, public assistance, etc.?
Well, they're classified as somebody who simply is under a deportation order. It's somebody similar to Lindy's situation, and so she can probably help answer this question as well. You can apply for a work permit, but it's discretionary, and usually that work permit is granted after Kim Ho Ma's case, the case that was alluded to earlier, in terms of their inability to deport someone. In terms of other public benefits, you're really not eligible for any benefits. If you go to an emergency room, a hospital is obligated to help you in the emergency room under the Hill-Burton law, but you're not eligible for long-term medical care. So there's very little that you're eligible for. If you are in a state and eligible to go to college, even if you're in a state that has a state version of the DREAM Act, it's often alluded to that for undocumented college-age students, you can qualify for in-state tuition benefits, but there's only a handful of states that offer that type of in-state tuition for undocumented. But you would at that point be considered in that category for purposes of in-state tuition.
Great, thank you so much, Bill. So for our next question, this person is asking, and I can address this, and I also invite the panelists if they want to give their 2 cents as well. What is the awareness level like within the AAPI community around issues of deportation? How can we improve the awareness and receptiveness of AAPI to engage in these issues? So I think with a lot of AAPI issues, we always do have to combat against the overall challenge or barrier of overcoming the myth of the model minority. So, you know, when you do talk about deportation in a larger way, folks don't necessarily connect it directly to the Asian American community, and largely because a lot of members of our community forget that there are certain segments that continue to struggle for a number of reasons. Specifically for Southeast Asian Americans who came here as refugees, and they have a very unique background, suffered multiple levels of trauma. People sort of are not aware of the intersection between this and the mass deportations that are going on within that community. But I think I can say that within the past couple of years, organizations such as SEARAC and One Love have been making strides in order to include Southeast Asian Americans within the broader discussion of deportation in the country. But I definitely think that there is still a long way to go. And I think in terms of how to improve awareness and receptiveness to engage APIs with this issue, I think it's also important to talk about deportation and its intersection with the criminal justice system here in the country. Especially right now, there has been a lot of movement and a lot of promises from our politicians, including the Obama administration, in terms of the importance of reforming the criminal justice system so that it's more just and more focused on a transformative model. And I think it's important to talk about this within the framework of deportation and understanding how it intersects with these broader issues. So I don't know if the panelists have anything else to add. And if not, we can go ahead. There's a bunch of other questions still left in the queue. Another question that we have, oh, and I'm not sure if you would know about this, Nelia. This is about repatriation again. Would Thailand need some sort of agreement as well? I was told that many Hmong refugees are getting dropped off there and not to Laos, and not from there, Thailand deports them to Laos. And from there, Thailand deports them to Laos.
I'd actually defer to Bill on this one. I think, Bill, you know more about the Thai repatriation agreement. They're pretty restrictive, right? I'm not sure.
Actually, I'm not sure either. I do know that that has occurred. But it's very suspect that somebody who was born, if the question is about somebody who was born in a Thai refugee camp, that would be very suspect, that the appropriateness and the legality of that. If you're talking about somebody who is Thai, who is from Thailand and committed a crime in the United States, that's definitely more possible. But somebody born in a refugee camp, that would be highly suspicious.
Great. Thank you, Bill and Nelia. So for the next question, it has to do a little bit about the current political climate. This person is asking, how have other presidential candidates, if at all, how have they responded to this situation? So I could talk a little bit about this. I've been finding, at least among the Democratic candidates, there is a lot of discussion in terms of reforming the criminal justice system, especially with the current momentum that the Black Lives Matter movement has had in these policy discussions. Recently, actually, AAPIs for Hillary reached out to SEARAC as well as a number of other Asian American nonprofits, trying to figure out suggestions for their immigration policy platform as it impacts our community. We did ask them their interest or if they could commit to sort of looking at criminal deportation from the lens of the Southeast Asian American community. And they did seem open and receptive into looking into this issue a little bit more, especially since this issue is very much tied, as I mentioned earlier, into criminal justice reform. And so far, Hillary has been showing that she is very committed into making the current system a bit more just and moving away from a strict enforcement policy framework. In terms of the other Democratic candidates, I mean, I don't know per se, there might be sort of other framing and messaging out there, but with regards to the specific issue of Southeast Asian Americans and criminal deportation, I feel personally that there still needs to be a lot of education that needs to be done. So we only have about 2 minutes left, so I apologize. I'm going to ask one last question for this webinar. For those that have typed questions into the screen, I can make sure to go through them and discuss them with the panelists as well. And we will try to get back to you with an answer on your question. And again, feel free to shoot me an email directly if you would like to follow up with me on any specific questions. Okay, so for the last question, slash comment, this person commented, I'm interested to learn how you all are engaging the deportation population to build the global movement. So I know that I can talk in terms of SEARAC's work, and then I know Mia Leah has been working with deported population as well in Cambodia, so I'm going to have her speak. So in terms of SEARAC's work, I think it's just elevating these individual deportation stories and making sure that they're getting a lot of attention and that they're being utilized to educate others within our community. So many Southeast Asian Americans that are often undergoing deportation orders, sometimes they are funneled to our office because they ask for our support in terms of advocacy. So there is one particular case right now, an individual named Chea Bu, who was brought to our attention through one of our partners. We helped him do advocacy on his deportation case, and unfortunately, we just heard word from ICE that he was issued a travel document and will actually be deported next week. So in terms of SEARAC's work, we intend to keep in close communication with his attorney as well as his wife to make sure that the advocacy that we've been pushing on his behalf doesn't just die out as soon as he's deported. We think it's important to kind of keep the pressure on our policymakers to give attention to these issues and to also make sure that our community is aware of what's going on. And Mia Leah, would you want to share as well? I know that you guys have been working directly with a lot of the deportees in Cambodia.
Sure, yeah. I think that, so yeah, we work closely with folks in Cambodia who've been deported, and they have been organizing actually for over a decade, right, since they got there, to come together and figure out how to support each other and to have like basically mentor folks as they're coming in, to be able to come into Cambodian community better and with more emotional, mental support. And so I think that we really feel strongly that in the movement on immigration, often when people are deported, it's as if they fell off the face of the earth. And so I think that in order for us to really build a strong movement, we have to push back against that kind of thinking and make sure that our deported community is part of this movement. And so in terms of communication, it's like having a Facebook group and making sure we get ideas and input and share information. And then also we're trying to plan a trip in the next few months for Southeast Asian Freedom Network team to go to Cambodia and build more with people on the ground in Cambodia, so that they are an active part of this movement.
Great. Thank you so much, Mia Leah. So with that, it's already a little past 5 o'clock, and I want to make sure that I don't keep folks on the phone for much longer than they blocked out for this webinar. So just to conclude, thank you again, everybody, for joining us for this presentation. We encourage everyone to please access this resource on the SEARAC website. Feel free to share it with partners. You can even print it out if you would like. We were going to be making this webinar as well as the PowerPoint available on the SEARAC website. And you're going to be receiving a follow-up email from us probably in the next 2 days that contains a link to the recording as well as a link to this PowerPoint presentation. And again, I encourage folks to reach out to us if you had any questions that were not answered. My email is on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me to connect in any way that you would like. Again, thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists, Bill, Mia, Leah, and Lundy, for sharing their stories. And we appreciate everybody for taking the time to join us this afternoon. And hopefully we can connect with you all in this very important work in the next couple of months. Okay, thank you everyone. Bye.